Shall we start?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to welcome everyone. Absolutely delighted to invite you here this evening. We've got two fabulous people with us, and my name's Kavya. I'm from Champaka, and welcome to the Reading for Change series that we do in collaboration with Bengaluru Sustainability Forum and Science Gallery Bengaluru, and of course Champaka bookstores. This is our sixth Reading for Change event, and we're discussing Kai Cheng Thom's Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, a dangerous trans girl's confabulous memoir, which is wonderfully brought to us by Zuban in India. And we're using it as an entry point to the SDG10, which is about reduced inequalities. And this book is super playful and a surreal fictionalized trans memoir, and you can get it at a bookstore. So I hope you pick it up as soon as possible. I'm so excited to introduce two people I really admire. Kai Cheng Thom is a writer, performer, and community worker based in Toronto, Canada. She's the award-winning author of several books that have been translated into many languages worldwide. She's been featured on a podcast by Julie Andrews and with Emma Watson's Feminist Book Club and the New York Times. She's a former social worker, and she's active in her community and engaged in issues of social activism, and is particularly interested in conflict resolution and transformative justice. Welcome, Kai Cheng. It's so nice to see you here. And of course, our own wonderful homegrown Nadika Nadja, who is very excited to have her here, who's a writer, researcher, and is interested in history, archaeology, gender, technology, and the internet. And I can tell you several other wonderful things. And she's currently based in Bangalore. So as I was saying, we look in this series, we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and we look at them through books so that we can bring them into daily thoughts and practice, and not just as distant landmarks in space and time. To introduce the three of us working together to bring this to you, Bengaluru Sustainability Forum is an interinstitutional consortium who creates a space for multidisciplinary conversations around Bengaluru's sustainable future. Champaka Bookstore, we're an independent women-run bookstore and a children's library and cafe. We bring diverse stories and perspectives for readers through books and events. The Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution for research-based engagement at the interface between the natural and human sciences, engineering, and the arts. So over to you, Kai Cheng and Nadika. Delighted to have you and can't wait to hear what you have to say.
So thank you so much, Kavya. Thank you, Lina, Mansi, Radhika, and everybody else who put together this event. Hi, Kai Cheng. So glad to talk to you again, and looking forward to what we're going to be talking about today. Before we begin, maybe do you want to talk a little bit about the book, how it came about, what you want to do with it? Because there are bits of things. Obviously, I read everything, and then page by page, it just built into me, and and the trans narrative around the world is so similar in many ways, yet so different in many ways also. So I could see myself in what you were doing and what the book was. So I just want to sort of get your idea of what you were doing, what you want to do with the book, and how you went about doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm very grateful and honored. I also feel like you are much more stylish than me, so I'm very intimidated by your beauty and the book, right? So Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, a dangerous trans girl's confabulous memoir. You have it there. That's amazing. It's also so nice to see the South Asian edition cover, because we have a different one for North America. It's very, very beautiful, the South Asian one. And yeah, so the book is a fictionalized memoir, and that piece of it, like the fictionalized memoir, is central to what I'm hoping to do with the book. It's quite incredible to hear that you saw yourself in parts of it, because I was really thinking, oh, I'm writing my little book. I never thought it was going to be published at the time that I was writing it, let alone translated or brought to a different continent. So I'm very astounded and honored by that, because what I was hoping to do was really write to my very local community. At the time, I was living in Montreal, the Indigenous name for which is Tiohtià:ke, in Canada. And I was just trying to capture the sense of what it meant to be an adolescent, coming out as trans, transitioning, and getting swept up in anarchist politics as well, and really wanted to break away from the necessity of having to write a very realistic, nonfiction autobiography, which in the English language canon has been sort of the only place that transgender writers could exist in for quite a long time. When you try to look for the earliest trans writing, it is mostly starting from the 50s, autobiography. And it's sort of this very realist, very sensational kind of like, I was a man and now I'm a woman, or I was a woman and now I'm a man. And it focuses a lot on surgery and hormones, oppression, and like this very particular narrative that, you know, paints itself as realist, but if we look at it carefully from like a literary perspective, also just contains many tropes, right? It's essentially a Cinderella story, right? Like sad little person who is marked for difference by the world, then goes through many challenges and changes, and then, you know, either ends up with a happily ever after, or, you know, lives in despair for the rest of their life. And I thought, you know, I wanted to honor the trans writers who had come before and written memoirs, so I wrote a memoir, but I also wanted to indulge my love of fiction, my love of fantasy, and the revolutionary capacities of those genres to spark the imagination and tell the truth in a different way. So that's the hope of the fictionalized memoir, is to create that power and beauty and mythology that cisgender or non-transgender readers just have access to automatically, right? I wanted to invoke that and have fun. I wanted readers to read my book and have fun, while also illuminating certain aspects of transgender experience, not for a cisgender audience, but for trans people. I wanted to have a reflection of ourselves that was written for us. Does that all make sense?
That makes perfect sense, because I could see that also. You know, like in the book, you grow up feeling a certain amount of responsibility to your family, especially if, I mean, you are a sort of a Asian family growing up in the North American continent, and there's some things that sort of inculcated in us and in the way we try to live lives and things like that. And, you know, the extraordinary pressure that parents put on things like education and taking care of our lives, and just being that, you know, sort of, there's a certain sort of frame in which we need to operate. And then the transition process is breaking out of frames that other people give us, and trying to find the frames that we match ourselves. So, and that sort of came through for me, and that's why I thought, you know, I could see myself in it, and also the way of moving to a different place and finding that amazing sisterhood of, you know, Kimaya and Rapunzel and Lucretia and people like that, and, you know, the sort of forming that group and forming that people who are at once, in a way, they're sort of friends and sisters, but they're also sort of competing in a certain way. You know, the dynamics of people in that queer community changing and all that. So it was very fun for me to read that bit.
So great.
So yeah. Are there any things that you'd like? You know, the other thing that pointed out, you know, we spoke about this earlier, and I think that's something important that I think I need to tell about myself, is that I'm a huge letter writer. I used to be a letter writer, and I'm not so much a letter writer now, because there's WhatsApp and Telegram and whatnot, and Twitter and things. But my coming out journey almost always happened over email. I wrote emails to my dad, to my brother, to my sister, to people like that. And so that throughout the book, there's letters to the sister Charity and how that works. And so I'd like to talk to you, maybe pick your brain a bit about that. Those letters, the emails to Charity.
I love that you're a letter writer, Nadika. I I think you should write a book. That's letters. I would definitely read that. I I love the epistolary or like letter-based format, and similarly, perhaps in some ways, was a huge letter writer earlier on, and then as I became more and more sucked into the internet milieu, dropped that increasingly, except for in fiction or sometimes in creative nonfiction. And I think what I love about the letter format is that it's a genre unto itself. And before WhatsApp and Telegram, everybody wrote in this genre. Everybody just wrote letters, but it was considered not literary for some reason until you died, and then someone collected all your letters, and then it was like, this record of who you were and how you wrote. And the thing about letters, a relationship conducted in letters, or a time when all long distance relationships were letter based, or even your own experience that you're discussing about coming out to people through the medium of email, is that it, like the letter proclaims itself to be nonfiction or autobiographical, right? We're always writing letters to other people and they're meant to be truthful. But letters are fiction, and because they're long form, they create this room to fictionalize. We create these characters in letters that aren't really quite us, and then we give them to other people. And that's what's happening in the book with the main character. She's writing letters to her little sister, and not fully representing what's happening in the rest of the plot. And I like to just let that ambiguity stay there, like not for the reader not to know which part is true, which part is false. There's such a deep magic in the letter writing format, and I would be curious to hear too about how your transition experience might have been different because it was mediated through the letter format rather than, for example, coming out in a WhatsApp message or face to face.
It was so the first person I came out to is a very good friend of mine, and I sort of I did write to her. Yes, I wrote to all my friends, except for a couple of friends. I think I came out to almost everybody over email. And I wrote long emails like, I used to be like this, and you've known me with different names, but this is the name I want to be now, and this is why it is that kind of, like you said, it's a bit of storytelling there. It's a long time ago I heard someone tell me that you have to keep writing your stories daily, so that by the time you're ready to publish a biography, you practiced it well and you know what story you want to say. So that's what I did with my letter, with my emails to people. With my dad, like I've had multiple names even at home. There's a nickname my parents call me, and then my friends call me a different name in school, growing up in school and things like that. So I used the idea of names and how my parents know me in different names to come out to them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this is my, Nadika is the name now I choose for myself, and how I, why I chose that name and things like that. So it sort of it builds that sort of story for me.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. I love what you're saying, because you're kind of saying like the letters were for the purpose of communicating your story to other people, but you're also communicating the story to yourself as you write it down. And I'm sure the story, shifts slightly, over time, because each letter probably had a different facet of who you were and what you wanted to share with that particular person. So I just think that's fascinating, and it's interesting to link that very personal experience to the UN sustainability goals too. I think because a major issue with like the advancement of human rights, we could call it that for trans people, is that our stories have been excised from written canon for such a long time. I mean, it varies from place to place and language to language, but for me, I come from like a Chinese and North American heritage, and North American settler, that is, like you have all these people saying like, well, there's no trans people in history, which of course is not true, but because we're so marginalized in the grand narratives of Enlightenment civilization, and then what followed after, it's like we're constantly reinventing the wheel, having to tell people we exist. And when you write these letters, there's now a record on the internet of you, the specifics of you and how you existed. And I think that's really important for your personal history, but also maybe for the history of trans people that's to come.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the ways in which I think in the last maybe 15 odd years, I think trans people, we have sort of pulled the narrative back to us.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in fiction, maybe in self-publishing, maybe on Twitter and social media and places like that. But a lot of the stories was told by other people about us. Mm-hmm. And now we sort of pulling that back. The whole idea of queer rights is also that, right, of reclaiming and pulling things back to us. But I think that's happening a lot in this space, maybe. A lot more stories are coming out, lots more people writing their stories rather than letting other people do autobiographies or biographies. It's like it's fierce femme, and it's that playful telling of rather serious things, but it's very, very done in that very light touch way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think that's like, yeah, I think that's so important because there's like the news article about transgender people or like the autobiography of trans people. But like, I sometimes like to ask cisgender people, like, what do you think your reading life or your life would be like if the only way you got information about the world was through autobiography and the news? Like, not cool, right? Like we need deep mythology. We need that playful touch you were talking about. We need poetry, and like we need every form of poetics to really know ourselves as human beings. And I think that's something that isn't always encompassed within our rights framework, right? To see ourselves reflected in the arts, but it's very key to knowing who we are, because I think the production of a culture, like a transgender culture that is written down or that is created graphically, is really, really important to us. Like knowing who we are and then being able to advocate for ourselves in the public sphere.
And also seeing more of us in public spheres, right? And that's,
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about, like, there's now a big controversy over who can play trans characters.
Yes.
And who should be playing and why can't, and the whole thing of this is art and this is not art, and actors can do anything, it's because that's part of acting. But how do you represent oneself, and how do you see more of oneself on this big screen or on TV or on other things? Mm-hmm. And when we say reducing inequalities, isn't that also part of that? Looking at ourselves, people like us out there doing mm-hmm. things that we want to be doing also.
Absolutely.
I'd like to read a chapter from the book, if that's okay.
Oh, yes, please. I've never heard someone else read it out loud before, so I'm very excited.
The story, the letters and that little poem to your pocket knife, those things are fantastic bits and pieces that sort of pull you out of the narrative, but also push you back into the narrative in many ways. But I think I will... anything that you would like me to read out?
Oh, no, I would love for you just to choose your favorite part.
Let me find the chapter. By the way, the lipstick lacerators are...
That's the girl gang in the book for the audience. There's a girl gang called the Lipstick Lacerators, and they beat up straight men for fun. It's very entertaining.
I'd like to read this chapter called The Story of Soraya.
Yes, please.
Okay. Soraya is dead. Her body was found yesterday in a dumpster behind the hotel on Scarlet Avenue, just 1 block from the Street of Miracles. Rumor has it she was beaten to death with a bottle because tiny shards of glass were found embedded in her scalp and cracked skull. The police are refusing to release many details, but have announced to one news source that cares that they have not yet ruled it as a homicide. And if she might happen to have fallen headfirst onto a bottle, 17 times or so, they will not investigate further. Why should they? A trans girl is found dead at least once every year in this city. I can hear some of their names filtering through the murmur of the crowd. Marilyn, Lotte, Ilsa, names of women I never knew but feel connected to in some terrible way. The news sends a ripple of anger and grief throughout the trans femmes and the city of smoke and lights. We gather in groups of 5, 10, even 20, cramming glamorous bodies into the tiny Femme Alliance building. Orange sparks fly through the air wherever our shoulders rub together. We can't just let the city bury this, said Rapunzel, shaking her braids. We have to stick together. Femmes, we have to push back. The other girls murmur and nod in agreement. What can we do? Lucretia asks. The police won't do anything. We are nothing to them, remember? They couldn't care less if we live or die. For once, I agree with her. We have to get into the streets, Rapunzel says. Her face is feverish. And Kimaya puts a hand on her back, steadying her. We have to demonstrate, Rapunzel continues. Show the mayor that we won't just sit quietly, waiting for someone to kill us too. Even if you have to go right into his backyard and yell it into his bedroom. Valeria stands up tall and imposing. Her bare scalp gleams like the moon. The mayor, she asks scornfully. The mayor and his pigs have worked against us, not for us. Everyone knows that. If we want justice for Soraya, we'll have to take it ourselves. I'm just going to stop here because the reason why, I mean, these stories are there in every city, in every place trans people live, and every place trans people, In fact, a few years ago, there was a trans woman called Tara who was set on fire in front of the police station.
Oh.
And just, I don't generally say trigger warning and content warning and things like that, but it just these things, and this whole thing of that almost painful sarcasm of, oh, she must have fallen on the glass bottle herself 17 times in a row.
Yeah.
It's the sort of narrative people send out. Somebody else, some other trans woman was running an entire restaurant employing other trans women.
Mm-hmm.
Was found dead inside her house. And the police said, we can't rule it out as, they first said it's suicide, but how could she pull herself? There's so many things that are happening. And so these were things, just these things that are, again, common in places. Trans people. But then from there it goes off into where the sort of giving the spark for the lipstick lacerators, right? This is So I just want to talk about that and maybe lead you into lipstick lacerators and talk a little bit more about the things that they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, what a horrible thing to happen with both of the stories you just shared. And it's interesting, this character of Soraya in the book, that chapter is like the most serious, like they're all serious, but like it's the most, actually the most non-fictional chapter in the book, in that death is based on a real one that happened here in Toronto, where a body was found in a dumpster, and it was a transgender woman. And anyway, it was ruled out as a homicide, but it was like, what? How could that not be a homicide under the circumstances? And yeah, this is the thing about trans lives, I think, is that people who are outside of the transgender community get really swept up in this narrative of, oh, you are a man and then you're a woman, or you're a woman and then you're a man, and the medical pieces and sexuality, all this stuff. And they miss what is the reality for us, which is that our lives are inflected by violence because of the ignorance and fear of other people. And there's a systemic aspect to that where as soon as we come out into the world as trans, and I think this is worldwide, although there are nuances to geopolitically, as soon as we embody transgender identity, especially being transgender women, I think there's a difference there between trans men and trans women. We become less important to the state and to society. And when we disappear, or when we die, or when we are assaulted, maybe I also should have said trigger warning. I tend not to say these things either, but maybe I should. When this happens to us, it's not considered important. And it's not considered worthy of the police attention. And also, police are just so generally not a good thing for many communities. Yeah. So there's that fear that so many young trans people, even in relatively privileged communities, when they come out, they still experience danger. And so, I wanted to come into this narrative that was a reverse of that. So I wanted to acknowledge the fear and the terror and the disempowerment. And I also wanted to tap into the strength, almost mythological strength, that I know all trans women and trans people have. And so the lipstick lacerators came out of this one night where I was walking home. I was quite young. I was maybe 19 or 20 or something. And I was being followed by a man. I lived in the sex district at the time. And so I was being followed by a man who I assume had some interest in me. And he said, "Can I come into your house?" And I said, "Oh, no, thank you. I declined." And then he started to bang on the door and try to break in through the window. And I was very terrified. I was also like an anarchist at the time. And so I was like, "Oh, I'm not going to call the police. I will just call my friends." But of course it was 2 a.m, so nobody picked up. And then I did call the police. And the police came, and then they said, "Oh, what's happening to you?" And the man was still there. And I said, "I'm being harassed by this man." And they said, "Oh no, where is the woman? A woman called us." And I was like, "No, it's me, I'm the woman." And then they said, "Well, he isn't doing it. Like, has he harmed you physically?" And I said, "No." And because of course I had locked the door. And they said, "Well, if he hasn't done anything, then he hasn't broken any laws. So see you later." And then they left. And I just remember the rage. It wasn't my fear, but my rage that I remembered in that moment. And I really just thought, I'll go into the kitchen and grab a knife and I'll just stab this guy to death, if he bothers me. And so, he did leave before either of us died, but it was that rage I wanted to write about. Like, what if I could make that man as terrified as he had casually made me? And what if, the police were as helpless to intervene in my affairs, like as I was to intervene in their conducting of their business or whatever. And so I wrote this story about, well, what if that rage came, what if we came together and just started beating up straight men for fun? And my publisher actually wrote me, I love my publisher, but they were sort of like, "Well, is this justice if they're just beating up straight men? And how do they even really know those men are straight to begin with?" And I was like, they don't. And that's the point. Like, if it's a true reversal, those men who kill and beat up and sexually assault trans women, they don't know anything about our lives. They don't really know who we are. They didn't pick us because we did something wrong. They just picked us because they thought we looked weird, or because they were attracted to us and got threatened by that. And so, I love to fantasize, but what if I just beat up a straight guy because I thought it would be fun, or because he was attractive and I was threatened by that, So yeah, I mean, and because, I live in a real world and live in where there are real consequences, I didn't want to stay in that fantasy. I also wanted to write about, revenge is delicious, but it truly is. But what happens when we take revenge, after the deliciousness, right? And what happens inside the soul? Like, I didn't really care to examine the legal consequences, because trans people experience legal discrimination all the time. I wanted to explore the consequences on the soul of violence. When we are violated, we can become violent. And does that help us? Yes and no. And this is what I love about the lipstick lacerator kind of fantasy, is that they're glamorous and they're strong, and that is never diminished by the fact that also violence corrodes us. And when we use violence to respond to external threats to our community, we will also use violence to respond to internal dissent. And that happens in the book a lot, right? And this is that sort of that loop that I'm very curious about, is when we use violence there, we'll use violence here, and what does that mean for us?
Yeah. that's the idea that recursive justice for trans people is just considered something that is of no consequence. Like, no matter what we, and you talked about how the police don't care, and there's this thing of you call and then they don't want to answer, but I mean they answer, but they expect someone else on the line, whatever, and then it's just it's up to you, and things like that. And the benefit of justice also is like extremely degraded for trans people in a way. Which we see here and here. There's this new trans act that has been passed in the parliament, and discrimination is just a fine of 500 rupees. Like, you can deny a trans person whatever things, and the discrimination and it's not. And then if I think it was 2,000 rupee fine if you grievously harm or physically assault a trans woman and things like that.
God.
Where is anyway.
Like, that's how much our lives are worth, right?
Yeah.
That's how much it costs to it's just sort of wild.
Pay a fine ahead of time, say, okay, listen, this is this trans person out here, I'm going to go beat them up. Here's your fine. I've paid my dues to society. It's like looking a murder. And anyway, so yeah, these things, and then obviously then the lipstick lacerators, and then you talk about the consequence of lipstick lacerators, and then there's also some sort of redemption for you. You meet someone, and then you get into some sort of a I say you, but the character,
the main character, or whoever,
we will maintain that.
The main character is nameless, so that we can all put ourselves in her position.
And then the idea of finding someone to love, and then that ridiculously the toilet paper, the idea of the toilet paper, which is the best thing that I read in that entire book.
Oh, I'm glad. That was my favorite thing to write.
So for people, please do read the book if you've not read it, and please read the last chapter of walking away from that ridiculous gold and whatever it is, and that the softest toilet paper on earth.
Yeah, that's funny. People are. I've had a lot of people talk to me about that ending, and I don't want to spoil it too much, but like there's this. How the main character of the book meets this very wealthy transgender man, and he wants to sweep her away into his world where the toilet paper is so soft and everything is made of gold. And I wonder. So I would love to hear if this has happened to you, Nadika. Like, because it's because I think in certain class demographics, wealthy people are now less afraid to come out as trans, because there's like trans people on TV and stuff. And so I'm noticing here in North America, like there's a whole new group of like young trans people who are like the children of bankers and lawyers, and so, and it's not to say they wouldn't have come out anyway, but coming out younger and coming out more easily and going to university, and maybe not experiencing quite as much of like the like street level oppression. Not that they won't experience anything, but they will be missing some aspects of that experience. And then sort of there's a funny relationship that happens. Have you noticed this at all?
Yes, I have. And I can't claim that I grew up with street oppression, because I've lived a fairly extremely privileged life in many ways compared to my sisters and my brothers in the trans community in India. I've lived a extremely protected life. I knew I was trans much earlier, but I was very afraid to come out because of so many things going on, and I was the eldest person in the family, and my family was sort of okay doing, but we couldn't afford it. Like, none of us as a family could afford to take a 5-day break and go off somewhere for a holiday, right? I mean, we were doing well. We had a roof over our heads and things like that. We had lived a fairly decent life. But then there were things like luxury that you don't think of. And I'm in no way comparing this to any of the other things that trans people face on the streets and all that. But there is that delayed coming out, which sort of eats at your inner whatever. Which, and then I see a lot of, I don't know where I'm going with this, but a lot of the narrative that I see online now about trans people is, yeah, it's easy, just come out, break the story, live your life, forget responsibilities and forget people and forget things, and which is fantastic if you can do it, and you know. But there is also certain things that you do as part of growing up and as part of living your life that maybe, and yes, definitely there is, we see cases of rich, celebrities, children who come out as trans, and then they're perfectly accepted and it's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Not grudging. In fact, I would, in a second, trade lives with them. Yeah. But that when newspapers write about them, it's completely different the way they write about other people who come out. Yeah. Yeah. I see similar, and then there's this growing in some places. I see a lot of trans people adopting a very privileged right-wing sort of hardcore politics.
Oh.
Which is like, that politics is going to eventually eat you.
Yeah.
That kind of mode of living is good for one or two of you, but it's not going to work for every one of us.
Absolutely. That's certainly true here as well.
And so these are things that I think about, and I see other people transitioning, and I feel a bit jealous because it seems a lot easier a path, but then I don't want to begrudge them. I just want it to be easy for all of us.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's not
and like not easy at anyone else's expense, right? Like I want, I don't know if I have the right to want this, but I want trans people who are coming out now, and everyone goes through their own challenges, not to say that rich trans children are like not experiencing anything. I'm sure they are, but like I want them to be connected to us, right? Like to our history of trans women and trans people, of trans sex workers on the street. Like I used to work as a counselor, like a clinical social worker, and I remember I once I was working with this younger trans woman whose parents were very wealthy, and I had never met a trans woman whose parents were very wealthy and she still lived with them before. So I was like, okay, and she said something that was like, I don't want people to look at me and think that I'm a sex worker because I'm trans. And I got it. I was like, I understand that. And then I didn't say this, of course, in the session, but in my head I thought, but I've been a sex worker, and all my friends have been, and what does that mean if you don't want to be associated with us, So anyway, I don't have good answers. These are things I think about at night.
Yeah, same. I don't think any of us will have the right answer for any of these things, right? And it's just something. In that sense, we are all, I don't know, I'm not even going where I think it should go. I think we should start taking questions. I think we've got a couple of questions. Someone's asking you, Kai Cheng, how did your background in social work influence the way you wrote this book?
Well, so my social work background has been like, ever since I was a teenager, I worked in community service in some way, even if I wasn't getting paid for it, right? So I was, doing workshops in high schools about homophobia very young, and then I volunteered at the queer youth center in Vancouver, and then I moved to Montreal, or to Oshaga, and I was doing that, and so it was my experience of that kind of like grassroots community organizing / service provision. Those two things are very mixed at that level. That got me thinking about stuff like in the book, there's like a building called the Fab, like the Femme Alliance building, and that's where one of the characters, Kamaya, runs this sort of social service milieu, right? And that is based in a lot of ways on these tiny little community centers, usually like in the attic of a different community center, where trans people, have been gathering and helping each other for a long time. I was later trained, clinically as a psychotherapist, and so I suppose that also really informed like the way that I write about trauma and like the psychological impact of violence. Although I could, that sort of is mixed together with my personal experience of the psychological experience of violence. So yeah, great question.
One more, I think this is also fantastic and question. I think can you tell us a little bit about why you use imagery of killer bees to represent trauma?
Oh yeah, these people have really read the book. I'm always shocked. I have to tell you, many times I go to book festivals here in North America and nobody has read the book that we're talking about. So this is great. I'm like, you know that. Okay. Yeah, so early on in the book, the main character has this experience that's two experiences. So first she describes falling into a bee's nest, essentially, and then being covered by the bees, and she takes a deep breath and just doesn't move. And this is also a real technique, by the way. If you are ever surrounded by bees, just don't move and like relax. Like bees can sense that you are agitated and they will become agitated. And so she's covered by them and then they eventually fly away. And then she immediately says, oh, actually, I made a mistake. This is how the story went. And then she talks about her body being invaded by a cloud of killer bees that enter her and actually never leave. And so I think like I'm obsessed with insects in a sort of weird way, and that's just very personal to me. I'm sort of in love with filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro, like who really focus on the beauty of like these sort of monstrous, almost otherworldly creatures. And I'm like I think a lot about, I guess, also working with people who struggle with trauma or mental illness, and not to stigmatize that, right? I too have experienced mental illness in my life, and like thinking about how often bugs come into it, like this like scratching or washing or feeling like we're being touched by bugs. And so I just, that buzzing constant presence that is painful, I wanted to represent in this way that was sort of materialized and visual. And I wanted there to be two experiences of that represented in the book, because there's this one kind of experience we can have where if we accept our trauma, right? If we just like sort of breathe into it, sometimes it leaves us alone, or sometimes it becomes a part of us, right? And then we can accept it. And then sometimes if we, no matter what we do, we're still being attacked and harmed by it, right? And I don't know if careful readers will notice that every time the main character is touched in a way that she doesn't like, which is most of the times, these killer bees start to move around in her body again. And yeah, I don't know, it was just something idiosyncratic about I'm obsessed with insects.
We have another sort of question similarly. What influenced the story of the mermaids in the first part of the book? Kaitlin Thorne asks you.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to give away all my secrets here. So the mermaids are these, giant, like monstrous mermaids that get beached in the first part of the book. And people who are familiar with like marine life, live near coasts and stuff, will recognize that this is actually a phenomenon that often happens with whales, that they swim too close and then beach themselves, and it's quite tragic. So this is the thing, is I'm not very I don't have a ton of faith in humanity. Like I kind of think that humans are bad people. But also there's something like one of the best things that I've seen, and I grew up near a coast, was when a whale beaches itself, there will be all these people who come, and then they pour the water on the whale to keep it alive because whales need to be hydrated in order to live. And then they'll try to push it back in the water. And actually, usually this fails because whales are big and they dry out and die, and they suffocate because of the weight of their bodies on their lungs. They can't live on land like that. So there's a few things. One was like, I love this image of like, nobody knows why whales beach themselves. Like maybe they get confused and just do it by accident, or it's a storm and they get pushed by the water. But in my romantic heart, I think sometimes about like, whales are extremely intelligent and they know that we're bad, but they come to visit us anyway. There's something about the shore that they love that brings them, even though it's dangerous. And that compulsion to move toward what we know will kill us is very interesting to me. And then that piece about like, well, who is it that is destroying the environment, right? It's us, human beings. And who is ruining the ocean? Us, human beings. And this sort of moment of us trying to save the whales, which was big in my childhood in North America. There was this like Save the Whales movement by Greenpeace. Like it's sort of ridiculous. Like we're saving the whales, but we're the ones who put them in danger, and we don't actually save them. But there's still something beautiful about that futile moment of saying, I'm sorry. Like I recognize this, and because whales are enlightened, perhaps, maybe not, this is just my imagination, maybe they forgive us. And what is it like to receive a forgiveness we don't deserve? Like there's a lot of lessons in there.
Yeah, I think they're definitely intelligent. A couple of questions around the idea of laws and how to bring about change. So Vani asks, does social media make it easier to come out and have these conversations, and are people being correct online? Do you see a dichotomy on and offline? This is a question that maybe you can answer. And then part of Vani's question is also, in India in particular, how do we start having these conversations in schools with youngsters that goes beyond just being woke?
I can't wait to hear you answer that. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say quickly, like, I think social media does in some ways make it easier because, first, because we are able to connect to each other more easily, and not everyone has access to social media or the internet or to like the language skills or whatever, but I think it's becoming more and more widespread that we can get on the internet and then very easily find other people who are trans or queer or whatever, and then quickly start to build solidarity. And we see all these examples of other people coming out, and so it becomes easier to come out. And then also say to our families or our friends, look, there are these other people too, it's not just me. So I think that does make it easier. I think also it makes it harder in some ways, because the news about us can be spread very quickly. Like damage can happen much more quickly to our lives and livelihoods and reputations. And also because I think there's inequities that form on social media and get enhanced by who has access, right? And who controls the narrative, who we get sucked into other people's ideas of what trans should be. And then I don't know, and this is me kind of trying to see from like the position that I'm in, which is difficult, but like my sense is that the United States and like North America more broadly have this hegemony on like transgender narrative, and I think that's bad for the world in a lot of ways. So I'll stop there and let you take it over.
No, yeah, I completely, yeah, it makes it a lot easier to come out and have conversations with people. Because there's also a bit of anonymity built into it. You can choose a certain level of anonymity. Of course, Uncle Zuckerberg and Jack and people are trying their best to kill this anonymity. But these, at some level, there is some built into it a sense of not having real life consequences, at least talking about these things online. And that is the biggest dichotomy I see between living an online life and an offline life, is that there are deeper consequences for taking one misstep in real life in the first world rather than in the second in the online world. but then the gap between that is fast decreasing, and we see that happening all the time, and people are being harassed, and the trolling and the consequences of the trolling is there. In terms of question of conversation with in schools and with youngsters and going beyond work, I think there are various ways in which this thing is being expressed. Somebody said justice, and justice is love expressed in law, and things like that. And in the book, there's a fantastic line: hunger is the story that gets you stuck. Love is the story that takes you elsewhere, takes you forward, right? And I think that if you approach something with the genuine attempt at understanding love and giving justice, I think that goes beyond wokeness, that goes beyond performativity of being of this person. I think, and I think young people get it at some level. At least in schools, it's not drilled into them yet. I mean, obviously there are levels of operation, levels of hate operating at various places, and depending on how privileged you are or not privileged you are, or how privileged the environment that this youngster is growing up in matters a lot. I think a lot of for me, coming out as trans shook me out of a very middle class, happy, contented life that I was living in. It shook me out. It gave me that crisis in which I started questioning other forms of oppression, other forms of being marginalized, although I was never marginalized myself as a young person growing up. It was all internally, and it never experienced it outside. But then coming out and living and talking to my other sisters and brothers and the queer community in life sort of shook me out of that crisis. It gave me that moment of crisis. I think if we understand that, maybe that wokeness will go out, and then we actually do things right. I don't know if that makes sense, Vani. Maybe we can talk about it later. There's also a question on, I think, from somebody from YouTube. What role do laws play in making up for the inequality that exists? For example, what impact did the Supreme Court judgment? I'm guessing this person is referring to the Nalsa judgment of 2014, which I will talk about, which gave legal status to transgender people. What sort of impact do these laws have? Do you want to take it up, Kai Cheng?
I mean, I wonder if you want to talk about, because I, of course, read about that Supreme Court ruling, but maybe you have more insight about it.
Yeah, so maybe just a quick background to this. This is called the Nalsa versus the Supreme Court of India. It was a verdict issued by the Supreme Court of India in 2014, I think April or May 2014, I'm not very sure. Which for the first time in India, and it was considered one of the most progressive rulings in the world at that point of time, which sort of gave complete rights for trans people to self-determine their own gender. So till then, there was a framework of, you're a man who's turned into a woman, or a woman, or, there was a third gender sort of lower level box that one had to take. But here, for the first time, you could determine your own gender. You could be man or woman or trans or whatever, or a combination of any of these things. And it also directed the government of India to provide certain services and certain benefits for trans people, considering that and then also something called reservation. I mean, reservation or affirmative action or whatever. For the first time, it was considered that trans people deserve that kind of affirmative action, kind of reservation in certain aspects like education, healthcare, and things like that. And so it was a very progressive judgment at that point of time. And it sort of mobilized a lot of work that trans people, trans communities, and trans groups and networks did at that point of time. And I was part of some of that work in the early bits of 2014 and 2015. And then our fantastic government of the time in 2015 came out with a draft bill called the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill, which did everything it could to negate the very Supreme Court judgment. And then the bill went progressively bad, and subsequent drafts, and finally the act that got ratified by the government and passed into law is probably the worst sort of law that you can, from 2014, which is one of the most progressive, to being of 2019, which is probably the worst fall from whatever you can think of. And so on one hand, that law helped us, but again, and then the fight, it sort of gave us the oxygen we needed for the fight ahead to fight this very bad bill. I guess that's my answer.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I had read about that ruling back in the day when it arrived, but I didn't, the media that I followed then quickly dropped it, right? So I was like, I didn't hear the rest of the story. So that's really, really interesting to know. Around the same time, different parts of Canada, like the federal government, but also the different provinces, started to enshrine gender identity as a protected category of human rights here in Canada. And it was interesting. That was met with I would say this is around 2015, 2016 that this is happening. And I think some people were very happy about it. But I don't know that it made a ton of material difference in trans people's lives. Maybe it did, but I didn't research this as a scientist, but my sense is if people want to discriminate against you, one can be discriminated against in housing or employment for being trans, and the person just doesn't say that, and then for a million reasons, right? And so I'm a bit suspicious of a language of identity-based rights in that way. I think it's very important, but I also don't think that we can rely on it as a measure to actually change people's lives unless there are also economic measures put in, right? If it's very easy to discriminate against anyone who is poor, which it is, in education, housing, or employment, or healthcare, then transphobia will exist in an exacerbated state, because people will just use class-based excuses to reject trans people. So yeah, I guess too, I'm very curious about it would be interesting to know how this works in different parts of the world, right? But I've heard a lot of critique of the framework of hate crimes, because what happens in the legal context that I'm familiar with, is that when we enshrine human rights, it sort of becomes a hate crime to attack somebody, and then because it's a hate crime, I guess it means stronger penalties can be imposed, but that doesn't solve the problem of trans people living in situations that are dangerous to begin with. It just means that we can punish people if that punishment is enacted by the police and then by the court, right? So yeah, I'm much more in favor of I think it's important that trans people can legally define their own gender. That's really important. It's also a recent development here, but there's a lot more things that need to happen in order for trans people actually to live socioeconomically stable lives.
Yeah. No, basically, coming from a position of this is crime and therefore this is the punishment for the crime, may be fantastic in theory, but then it's not negating the effects of that crime on the people who are most vulnerable to that crime. We got a couple of more. I think we got time for a couple of more questions. Rishit asks you, Kai, can you tell us more about spirituality and trans experience, as you often do? Often refer to. I'm a trans person from India and follow you on Twitter and have read your book. And I would like, Rishit asks you to talk about spirituality and trans experience.
Oh, good question. Dangerous question. I do often talk about spirituality, but this is because I am a very spiritual person, and I guess I think I'm nervous about it because I know not every trans person is obviously spiritual or religious, and obviously, I have a particular view of gender that I don't think I need to enforce on anybody else. What I mean is, I have I was raised evangelical Christian a little bit, and then my family quickly left the church after we started, and although my mom is still pretty Christian, and yeah, and so I grew up with a worldview of like man and woman, and good and evil, and Jesus, and then as part of my finding healing from some of the wounds that were inflicted by that, developed a view of gender that is very rooted in spirituality. And like when I think about how I know what my gender is, I think about like what is happening deep inside of me, and how does that connect to the bigger world. I have this belief that like trans and queer people are spiritually gifted also. And I know, a lot of people share this belief. I think there's a lot of resonances in various cultures and history about like this, where queer people or trans people, obviously they weren't called that throughout history, were seen as spiritually gifted or touched in some way. And I think that's very important when it comes to remembering like that there's a mythological dimension to all of humanity. Like all of us think in terms of story and spirit, and we look for higher meaning, and it's so important that trans people have the right to reclaim our connection to that. Yes, on the other hand, I think we shouldn't have to rely on that in order to have human rights. In the same way that we shouldn't have to rely on this idea that being trans is scientific in some way. There's a lot of studies, or there were a few years ago, about do trans people have different brains, or is there a gene or something genetic that makes people gay or trans? And that may be so, or it may not be. My guess is it's probably like a mix of various factors that make someone trans, right? But like we shouldn't have to be born trans in order to have rights, and we shouldn't have to be like made trans by God in order to have rights. But if you're just asking me, I do think that being trans is very similar to going through a spiritual initiation, because we have to leave like the confines of like normal society, often have to step outside of the family and go through like a journey of like a crisis-based journey. And how could we help but develop spiritual insight because of that?
That's actually quite interesting, because one of the terms used for trans women in India is hijra, which comes from a Persian Arabic word meaning hijra, meaning to leave one's tribe.
Oh.
Somebody who leaves the tribe and moves out on their own, or sort of takes a journey. And it's sort of, I like the word, but I also think that the word has been abused so much in India, in the Indian context. Therefore, I wouldn't want to apply that onto myself. But I like the deep understanding of that word, and I think if you all knew what it meant and how it means and the journeys that matters, it's fantastic. Last couple of questions, and I think we can sort of combine this. Can you tell us about the books you like? What sort of books you like, and what sort of books you write? And then there's one specific question about which trans writers' works do you really enjoy reading?
Oh yeah, you're gonna answer this too, right, Nadika? I want reading recommendations from you. Yeah. I read very eclectically, which is my way of saying I don't have like a structure. I just read whatever I want, sometimes based on the cover, which is not a very good way of picking. But let's see. I think being a professional author means I also have to read a lot for work, because one has to read what one's friends are writing, of course, or at least read enough to pretend that we fully read the book. Well, now I'm getting myself in trouble. But so I read. So I read. Like just by nature of that, I actually read like a very good percentage of all the Canadian literature like that comes out, just because I have to. But there's some great stuff happening, I think, in Canadian literature, as I say this to my audience in South Asia, because there's a real amazing resurgence slash like incredible developments happening in Indigenous writing in Canada. So Indigenous people in Canada are coming up with amazing work that combines like the digital era with like, rights-based frameworks that have been going on for a long time, plus mythology and cultural reclamation. Like, so I really recommend people to read Eden Robinson, whose book Son of a Trickster recently won a whole bunch of awards. She's fantastic, and I think like Indigenous voices all around the world, and really we need to uphold and support them. But also the book is just amazing on its own, and just to discover like people like Joshua Whitehead, or also Katharina Vermette. These are all Indigenous writers from different backgrounds here on Turtle Island, which is an Indigenous appellation for North America. I also really I'm like a classics reader, unfortunately. So I've read a lot of like the classic canon, but I'm not going to spend too long on that. I also really love American Black writing. So I'm always recommending Toni Morrison and Ntozake Shange to people. Like, this is really Audre Lorde, of course. Like, this is where I think I developed like a sense of like what it means to be revolutionary, or try to be a revolutionary writer, mostly from Black feminist or womanist writers. And then, of course, I really love like diasporic writing, because I'm a diasporic creature. So I used to read a lot of Asian American literature. I also read a lot of Canadian Asian literature. Got kind of bored with that, because I think like the diasporic Asian writing got stuck, a little bit, like always kind of talking about like homeland and where is that, and all this, but now I think there's starting to be some more interesting stuff coming out around like what does it mean to have a diasporic identity, but not be lost in the past, right? And like how can we be connected to like movement and like political and cultural movement happening now. Trans writers, I mean, I really recommend, gosh, I don't know if I'm pronouncing their name correctly, but Akwaeke Emezi. I'm going to write that in the chat so that people can have the actual spelling. Also, writers like Ariel Twist is an Indigenous trans writer here in Canada. And let's see, gosh, Imogen Binney wrote a book called Nevada, which is very American, but still really worthwhile, I think. Yeah, I'm just really interested in trans literature that is like doing this thing about like writing and reflecting for trans people, and not trying to explain us to like sort of like to the cisgender society, or not so interested in that as much. Nadika, anything?
Actually, I also have no specific recommendations or favorites or things that I read. I read a lot of history-based stuff, because I have delusions of being a historian, so I sort of try and read around that subject. I read a bit of Tamil. I speak Tamil at home, and I'm a Tamil person, so I speak a lot of my reading right now is based on Tamil and Tamil linguistics and Tamil language and Tamil culture and stuff like that. So I read a lot of that, which I don't know if you can put it on any specific list or anything. It's just I read about cities and histories and things like that. So I think that's basically it. The trans, actually, I haven't read, and I shouldn't be saying this in public, and so apologies to everybody who came before me and who will come after me, to my 4 sisters and 4 brothers and everybody. I've not read too many trans persons literature, except I've read lots of Kamala Mackerel. Am I saying the right?
Yes, how can I forget my dear wife, Kamala Mackerel? Sorry. God, she's going to be that you remember, but not me. Go on.
On Tumblr that I used to read pretty much all the time. So a lot of my reading of trans people are on things like Tumblr and Medium and places like that. So that's how I've read. And then there was a series of writing on was it Broadly or Wise or something? A lot of people wrote about trans desire and trans lives and things like that, which I think was fantastic reading. Kamala Mackerel and people in that big community of which Kamala was the Polestar sort of person, right? So yeah.
Nadika, do you know Kama? Have you ever spoken to her? Like, if you want to be introduced,
I would love to.
Let's make that happen.
I would love to. Yeah, I've read her so much, and it's like I use the term Polestar. It's like looking at her and finding my true north, right? So that's sort of what
I'll tell her you said that. She's gonna be thrilled.
Yeah, so those are the people I've read. I have earmarked a couple of people whose books have come out recently, people I follow on Twitter and Insta and places like that. Trans women writers who've come out with new books that I would love to read because it seems so much fun. So yeah. So I've read Les Feinberg and people like that who sort of set the stage, I think, in a way of creating this dialogue for us. But again, that's not really fiction or whatever, right? So it's Stone Butch Blues or the trans liberation or things like that are more manifestos than books.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. I want to second that Kamala Mackerel recommendation. She just has a book out right now called Zamfam, which is like a beautiful book of poetry. But also it's like narrative, so it tells a story about a trans young person growing up in Mauritius. And yeah, it's incredibly beautiful. It's amazing. Like in the past 5 years, there's been like a big surge of trans writers, particularly transgender women or trans feminine people, and racialized trans women too. And I think that's so amazing. Like, it's once you start to find one, we find more and more. Jamie Barout is another one, like a Latina or Latinx trans writer in the United States who's doing some amazing stuff. Kokumo Kinetic is a poet who won the Lambda Literary Awards a few years ago, who I recommend as well. Like, yeah, just really. Oh, one more. Casey Plett is like a Mennonite trans woman who recently won an Amazon First Novel Award for her book Little Fish, and it's an interesting example of a book. Is very specific because it's about a Mennonite trans woman living in Winnipeg, which is like one of the it's actually a major city in Canada, but smaller relative to many cities in the world, and it's so specific. But it's so it's sort of like one wonders like how could people who are not from that perspective enjoy it, but it's because it's so specific, we get to dive into this world and find universality in it. So I really recommend that book too. I wonder, we're probably running out of time, eh?
I think, yeah, we're done, I think. Do you have any more questions?
Hello, sorry to bring my face into this. This was such a lovely chat. I don't want this to end at all. But yes, I think we do have to stop soon. That was so wonderful. Thank you so much. I could just watch the two of you talk to each other all evening. I'm going to end with a few banal statements, but necessary ones, because we have this great alliance with Science Gallery Bengaluru and Bengaluru Sustainability Forum. And yes, we have this wonderful book at our bookstore. Please go to www.champaka.in to get yourself a copy of it. And we do have some other texts, and we'll see if we can try and get some of the books that both of them recommended. So Reading for Change, as all of you might know, is that we've tried to think about how books help us understand our lives, and they can help us think of the future of our planet and all the problems that we're going to have as we carry on. So in these series of events, we look at the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN and try to bring them close to our lives and not some sort of distant goals. So we're going to have a series of events as we move forward. We hope to see you soon there. We had a giveaway of Kai Cheng's book, and someone called Abhilasha, whose Instagram handle is KAUMRED, has won the book. We'll get in touch with you. Congratulations, it's such a good book. And thank you, Nadika. Thank you, Kai Cheng. We hope to talk to you again soon and about many interesting things. And we'll put together all the wonderful things you said. I've got some quotable quotes down that I think we need to share. And of course, thank you so much, everyone who's joined us today. It's so nice to have all of you together here.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kai Cheng. I think we should keep talking because I don't think this is, and I'm not saying this for the camera or for the whatever, for Zoom or whatever. I think, whatever, I'm sort of in love
I
with
would
you.
love to connect more. This has been really fun. Even though I had to get up early to do it. Thank you so much. It's been really, really wonderful. It's really actually truly an honor. And I'm also not saying that for Zoom.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Kavya. Thank you, Mansi. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you and good night.